I thought the worst consequence of my hike would be a sprained ankle, not the silent, earth-scented shadow that has followed me home from the woods and now sleeps in the corner of my room. The oppressive heat of the summer hike was a physical weight on my shoulders, and the narrow trail through the old-growth forest felt like a winding green oven. My friends, Alex and Maya, were far ahead, their cheerful banter fading into a distant murmur swallowed by the dense thicket of ancient oaks and whispering pines. I had stopped to retie my bootlace, a simple, mundane task that fate would twist into a nightmare. As I rose, a sharp, unexpected pain shot through my ankle. A loose root, disguised by a blanket of decaying leaves, had betrayed my step. I stumbled forward, my arms flailing wildly in a desperate attempt to regain balance, and crashed through a brittle wall of undergrowth that I hadn't even noticed was there. The world became a violent blur of green and brown, the sharp snap of branches a stark contrast to the forest's serene silence, and I landed hard on my knees, the damp, pungent smell of rotting vegetation and cold soil filling my nostrils. My initial reaction was a surge of hot embarrassment, grateful that no one had witnessed my graceless fall. I pushed myself up, brushing the dark, moist earth from my jeans, my hands coming away stained and smelling of peat. It was then that my eyes focused on what my stumble had uncovered. Partially buried by time and a careless layer of forest debris was a stone, not a natural rock, but one cut with unnerving precision. It was a small, dark slate, angular and crude, unmistakably worked by human hands. With a curious, slightly trembling hand, I swept away the clinging moss and a handful of wet black soil, my fingers tracing the rough, cold surface. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This was no ordinary stone. This was a marker, a grave marker, hidden away from the world, forgotten by everyone but the forest itself. A profound, eerie silence descended upon the clearing, as if the very air had been sucked out of it. The cheerful shouts of my friends were gone, replaced by an absolute deafening quiet that felt heavy and intentional. Leaning closer, my heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs, I scrutinized the stone's face. There was no name, no dates, no epitaph to honor whoever lay beneath. Instead, crudely chiseled into the weather-worn surface was a single line of numbers: 1898, 1912. A chill, completely disconnected from the summer heat, crawled its way up my spine. 14 years? That was all this person had gotten? A short, brutalized life? And then this? An anonymous resting place in the middle of nowhere, remembered only by a number? A voice, distant and faint, called my name from the main trail. It was Alex. The spell was broken. I scrambled backward, away from the stone as if it had burned me. Getting to my feet, I didn't bother to brush the dirt off my clothes. My only thought was to get away, to rejoin the world of the living, to leave this forgotten corner of death behind. I pushed my way back through the broken undergrowth, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and stumbled onto the main path where Alex stood, looking annoyed. "There you are. We thought you got eaten by a bear or something," he joked, but his smile faded when he saw my face. "Whoa, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I just nodded, unable to form words, and pointed weakly back toward the thicket. "Just tripped. Let's just keep going." The rest of the hike was a blur. I was physically present, putting one foot in front of the other, but my mind was trapped back in that clearing. The numbers 1898, 1912 were seared into my thoughts. Who was that? A child? Why here? The carefree joy of the day had evaporated, replaced by a deep, unsettled feeling of intrusion, of having disturbed something that was never meant to be found. We finally made it to the scenic overlook, the valley spreading out before us in a breathtaking panorama of green and gold, but the beauty was lost on me. All I could see was that dark, cold slate and feel the oppressive silence that surrounded it. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, but the warmth didn't reach me. I felt a coldness from within, a chilling premonition that my accidental discovery had not been noticed, that a connection had been made, a connection that was now following me home.
The car ride home was a silent, tense affair, a stark contrast to the boisterous laughter and upbeat playlists that had filled the vehicle on the way to the trailhead. I sat curled against the passenger door, my forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching the dense, shadowy forest gradually give way to the familiar streetlights and neatly manicured lawns of suburbia. Alex and Maya, sensing my profound disturbance, had eventually stopped their attempts at cheerful conversation, allowing a heavy quiet to dominate the space, broken only by the hum of the tires on asphalt. I replayed the moment of the fall in an endless, torturous loop, the snap of the root, the crash through the brush, the feel of that cold, rough stone beneath my fingertips. It felt less like a memory and more like a contamination, a vile smudge on my consciousness that I couldn't wipe away, no matter how hard I tried. The world outside my window seemed normal, safe, and predictable, but I felt irrevocably separated from it, as if I were viewing everything from behind a thick, distorted pane of glass. Arriving home did nothing to alleviate the deep-seated chill that had taken root in my bones. My house, usually a sanctuary of comfort and familiarity, felt different. The air inside was still and watchful, the shadows in the corners seeming deeper, more substantive than they should have been at that hour. I dropped my muddy backpack by the door with a thud that echoed too loudly in the silence and headed straight for the shower, desperate to scrub away the grime of the forest and the lingering psychic residue of that forgotten grave. The hot water scalded my skin, turning it a bright pink, but I still felt cold, a core-deep frigidity that the steam and heat could not penetrate. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, afraid of what I might see in the vapor, half expecting to see those numbers, 1898, 1912, scrawled on the foggy glass of the shower door. The sound of the water seemed to morph, at times, into a distant, whispering rustle, like feet dragging through dry leaves. That first night was a descent into a new kind of terror, one that was subtle, psychological, and utterly paralyzing. I lay rigid in my bed, every sense heightened to a painful degree, straining against the oppressive silence of my dark room. The familiar nighttime sounds of my house, the creak of settling floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, were now sinister, each one a potential sign of something else, something other. And then it began. A smell. Faint at first, almost imperceptible beneath the clean scent of my laundry detergent. It was the rich, loamy, and unmistakably foul odor of freshly turned earth, of deep soil and decay. It was the exact same smell that had filled my nostrils when I fell onto my knees in that hidden clearing. My heart seized in my chest. I held my breath, praying it was my imagination, a phantom scent summoned by my traumatized mind. But it grew stronger, coalescing into a palpable presence in the room, a thick, cloying perfume of the grave that had no right, no possible reason to be there. I spent the remaining hours until dawn, trapped in a state of wide-eyed, breathless panic, too terrified to move or even to cry out. The earthen smell would wax and wane, sometimes retreating to a barely there hint near the window, other times swelling to an overwhelming wave that seemed to originate from the corner of my room, the darkest corner, where the shadows from my closet and desk merged into an impenetrable pool of blackness. It was from that corner that I began to hear it, a soft, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing. It was a slow, deep, and regular inhalation and exhalation, the sound of a creature that is utterly calm and at rest. It was the sound of something sleeping. Something that had followed me home. Something that was now claiming a space in my world, making itself comfortable in the darkness just a few feet from my bed. The rational part of my brain screamed that it was impossible, but every primal instinct I possessed knew it was real. I was no longer alone. The first gray light of dawn finally crept through my blinds, bleaching the color from my room and banishing the shadows back to their daytime hiding places. As the sun rose, the horrifying sensory phenomena faded with it. The smell of soil dissipated, and the sound of breathing ceased, leaving behind only the crushing fatigue of a sleepless night and a soul-deep trembling dread. I finally uncurled my stiff body from the defensive ball I had been in, my muscles aching. I looked over at the dark corner. It was just a corner again, empty and mundane, but I knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in my veins, that it wasn't empty. Something was there. It was just waiting for the dark to return. My home was no longer my own. It had become a shared space, and my unseen roommate had brought the grave in with it.
The rational part of my mind, though battered and frayed, launched a desperate counteroffensive against the terror of the night. It had to be psychological, a classic case of suggestion and paranoia. I had stumbled upon a tragic, forgotten piece of history, and my overactive imagination had concocted the rest: the smell, the breathing. It was a trauma response, nothing more. I decided on a course of aggressive normalcy, a forced return to routine that would prove to myself that I was still in control. I cleaned my room with a frantic, manic energy, scrubbing every surface with lemon-scented disinfectant, spraying generous clouds of air freshener toward that dreaded corner, and opening the windows wide to let the bland, safe air of suburbia flood in. I even moved my desk, creating a physical barrier between my bed and the dark space, a feeble attempt to reclaim territory from an enemy I couldn't see. The daytime sunlight felt like a shield, a benevolent force that held the haunting at bay, and I clung to it, refusing to even glance toward the closet or the rearranged corner for too long. My friends, Alex and Maya, noticed my change in me immediately during our video call that afternoon. The screen felt like a lifeline, a portal to a world where logic still reigned. "Dude, you look terrible," Alex said, his face pixelated with concern. "Did you even sleep? Was your ankle that bad?" I forced a laugh, a dry, brittle sound that cracked in the middle. "No, the ankle's fine. Just couldn't shut my brain off, you know? Kept thinking about that weird rock I found." I tried to sound casual, dismissive, but my voice carried a tremor I couldn't quite suppress. Maya leaned closer to her camera, her brow furrowed. "What rock?" I gave them a sanitized version, omitting the numbers and the visceral horror, describing it only as an old, probably historical marker. "It was just creepy," I finished, shrugging with a nonchalance I absolutely did not feel. Spooked myself good, I guess. Their skepticism was palpable, a silent exchange of glances between them that spoke volumes. They wrote it off as post-hike exhaustion, but the conversation felt hollow, a performance of normalcy that only emphasized how isolated I had become in my fear. As evening descended, my carefully constructed facade of control began to crumble. The sun dipped below the horizon, and with it, my courage evaporated. The familiar evening rituals felt like a countdown to an execution. Every creak of the house settling, every groan of the pipes was a potential footstep, a sign that my nocturnal guest was stirring. I avoided looking directly at the corner, but my peripheral vision became a traitor, conjuring shifting movements in the darkness that vanished when I turned my head. Then the cold began. It started as a slight draft, a chill that the central heating couldn't seem to combat. I turned up the thermostat, put on a thick hoodie, but it was useless. This was not a temperature of the air. It was a cold that emanated from a specific point, a localized frost that seeped into the very bones of the room. It radiated from the corner, a wave of supernatural frigidity that defied all laws of physics. The smell returned with the cold, stronger now, more assertive. It was no longer a faint hint of soil. It was the thick, cloying, and wet scent of deep-turned earth, of a grave freshly dug in cold ground. It was the smell of the grave I had disturbed. And with it, the breathing resumed. The slow, rhythmic, slumberous sound from the corner was no longer a faint suggestion I had to strain to hear. It was now a clear, audible presence in the room, a steady hush-hush that underscored the silence, making it infinitely more terrifying. It was the sound of something ancient and patient,
something that was deeply, utterly content to simply exist in my space, to share my air. I lay paralyzed under my blankets, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, every fiber of my being screaming in silent terror. The entity was no longer just a sensation. It was establishing its reality, making its presence known more boldly, demonstrating that my disbelief, my cleaning, my rearranging were all utterly meaningless. It was here, and it was staying. The worst part, the element that truly shattered any last vestige of hope, was the feeling of being watched. It was a palpable pressure against my skin, a predatory awareness focused solely on me. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, a gaze from the darkness that was ancient, empty, and utterly fascinated by the living, breathing warmth of me. It wasn't just sharing my room, it was studying me. The horror was no longer about what might happen. It was about this unbearable, ongoing violation of my privacy, my safety, my very soul. The night stretched before me, an eternity of exquisite terror, and I understood with devastating clarity that this was my new reality. The thing from the woods had not just followed me, it had moved in, and the haunting had evolved from eerie phenomenon to a relentless psychological siege. I was a specimen in a jar, and the lid had been screwed shut.
The library was supposed to be my sanctuary of logic, a temple of recorded history where every mystery had a solution buried in a book. I moved through the hushed aisles, the smell of old paper and dust, a welcome replacement for the phantom scent of soil that had plagued my bedroom. My mission was simple, clinical: find historical records, land surveys, anything from the turn of the 20th century that might mention a burial, a tragedy, or even a missing child in the area of the state park. I spent hours hunched over microfiche readers, my eyes straining at blurry scanned copies of local newspapers from 1912. The world of 1912 was all bustling industry and societal gossip, completely oblivious to the small personal tragedy I was seeking. There was nothing. No mention of a lost 14-year-old, no reports of a body found in the woods. It was as if the person in that grave had not only died without a name, but had been erased from history itself, their existence reduced to crude numbers on a hidden stone. The lack of information wasn't reassuring. It was profoundly more frightening. It meant this entity was truly alone, utterly forgotten, and now it had chosen me to remember it. Frustrated and feeling more isolated than ever, I decided to take a different tack. If I couldn't find the history, perhaps I could document the present. Pulling up my phone, I scrolled back through the photos from the hike, past the smiling selfies at the summit and the scenic landscape shots, until I found them. The pictures I had taken just before my fall. There was one, a slightly blurry image of an interesting fern I had stopped to examine. And in the background, just off to the side and out of focus, was the dense thicket I would moments later stumble into. My heart began to pound. With a trembling finger, I zoomed in. The image pixelated, but there, barely visible through the tangle of branches and leaves, was a faint, dark shape. It could have been a shadow, it could have been a rock, but it was roughly the right size, the right shape. It was proof. To anyone else, it would be nothing. To me, it was everything. It was a tether back to reality, evidence that the stone existed outside of my nightmare. That night, I prepared. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now mixed with a desperate, determined resolve. I would not be a passive victim in my own home. I propped my phone on my nightstand, its camera pointed directly at the dark corner, the record button activated. I needed proof. I needed to hear the breathing on a recording, to maybe even see a fluctuation in the light, anything I could analyze, anything that could prove I wasn't losing my mind.
I lay down. The phone's screen, a small, comforting square of light in the oppressive darkness, and waited. The familiar dread descended as the house fell silent. The cold seeped out from the corner first, a wave of frigid air that made me pull the blankets up to my chin. Then the smell arrived, that rich, loamy odor of dank soil. Finally, the breathing began. That slow, rhythmic, sleeping sound. I lay perfectly still, my eyes fixed on my phone screen, watching the timer on the recording tick onward, second by agonizing second. I was capturing it. The evidence was piling up. I must have fallen into a fitful, exhausted sleep because the sound of my own alarm screaming at 7 a.m. jolted me awake. For a single blissful moment, everything felt normal. Sunlight, the alarm's blare. Then the memory of the night and the experiment came crashing back. I fumbled for my phone, my heart already beginning to race with a nauseating mix of hope and terror. I stopped the recording, and without giving myself time to hesitate, opened the video file. The screen showed my dark room, the faint light from the window illuminating the outlines of my furniture. I turned up the volume. Nothing. Just the faint hum of my computer and the rustle of my own movements in bed. I fast-forwarded. More silence. I let it play at normal speed, my ear pressed to the speaker, straining. There was no breathing. There was no sound at all from the corner. The audio was pristine, empty, a perfect record of a completely silent night. A sob of frustration and despair caught in my throat. It hadn't worked. It was toying with me. In a final, furious act of defiance, I grabbed my phone and swiped back to the photo from the hike, to my one piece of evidence. I needed to see it, to reaffirm my sanity. The image loaded. I zoomed in again on the thicket, searching for the dark shape of the stone. But it was gone. The spot where it had been was now just a blur of green leaves and brown branches. There was no dark shape, no hint of anything man-made. It had been there yesterday, I was certain of it. But today, it was gone. I stared, my blood turning to ice in my veins. It wasn't just hiding from my microphone, it was erasing itself. It was systematically dismantling every anchor I had to reality, every shred of proof, leaving me utterly alone and adrift in this nightmare. The message was clear. Your proof is meaningless. Your history is what I say it is. You are mine. The despair that followed was absolute, a black hole swallowing what little fight I had left.
The despair from the vanished photo and the silent recording was a lead weight in my soul, crushing me into my mattress long after the sun had risen. What was the point of fighting? What was the point of seeking proof when the very rules of reality seemed to be rewriting themselves around me? I was a ghost in my own life, moving through the days in a fog of exhaustion and terror, jumping at every shadow, my senses perpetually straining for the first sign of the encroaching chill. Conversations with my parents became impossible. Their concerns about my pallor and lethargy were met with mumbled excuses about stress and sleep disorders. The gap between my world and theirs had become an unbridgeable chasm. I was alone in a crowded house, a prisoner in a cell whose bars only I could see, and my jailer was an invisible, breathing cold that waited for nightfall. The idea came to me, not as a flash of inspiration, but as a pathetic, desperate surrender. If I could not fight it, if I could not prove it existed, then perhaps I could appease it. It was a relic of the past, a thing from a forgotten time. Maybe it was lonely. Maybe it was angry at being disturbed. The childish logic of it was almost embarrassing, but it was the only card I had left to play. That afternoon, driven by a feverish need to do something, I went into the town's small historical society museum. It was a dusty, quiet place, frozen in time itself.
I wandered the exhibits of old farming tools and sepia-toned photographs until I found a small display case of toys from the late 1800s and early 1900s. There, sitting beside a porcelain doll with a cracked face, was a small, hand-whittled wooden horse. It was simple, crude, and achingly lonely. It felt right. I bought a cheap woven basket from a craft store on the way home. My heart was pounding the entire time, a frantic drumbeat of fear and absurd hope. As dusk began to paint the sky, I carried the basket and the small wooden horse upstairs to my room. My hands were shaking. This was either the dumbest thing I had ever done or my only chance at salvation. I placed the basket in the corner, the very epicenter of the haunting. It looked ridiculous, a quaint picnic accessory sitting in the dark space where an ancient terror resided. With a reverence that felt both sacred and insane, I placed the small wooden horse inside the basket. It was an offering, a peace treaty, a silent plea spoken in a language of objects from its time. I remember you, I thought, the words screaming through my mind. I see you. Please, just leave me alone. That night, the anticipation was a different kind of torture. I lay in bed, staring into the darkness, waiting. The cold came, as it always did, a creeping frost that started in the corner and spread outward. The smell of wet earth followed, filling my nostrils. And then the breathing. The slow, rhythmic sound that had become the soundtrack to my terror. But tonight, something was different. There was a pause. The breathing hitched just for a second, as if the sleeper had been subtly disturbed. My own breath caught in my chest. I strained my ears, every cell in my body on high alert. Then I heard it. A new sound. A faint, almost imperceptible sound of wood scraping gently against woven reed. A tiny, delicate clack. It was the sound of the small wooden horse being moved inside the basket. It wasn't thrown or broken. It was touched, explored, acknowledged. A torrent of conflicting emotions flooded me. Profound relief so potent it brought tears to my eyes, immediately followed by a deeper, more insidious horror. It was real. It was not only sentient, but aware of its environment on a tangible physical level. It had interacted with my offering. My experiment was a success, but the results were more terrifying than failure. I had not appeased a ghost. I had fed a wild animal. I had confirmed a line of communication, and in doing so, I had invited a deeper, more intimate level of engagement. The breathing resumed, but it seemed closer now, and for the first time, I detected a new quality in it. Not the sound of sleep, but of quiet, watchful contemplation. It was pleased, and I was never more frightened in my life. I had just taught it that it could ask for things.
The despair that followed the revelation of the erased photo was an abyss from which I saw no escape. The entity wasn't just haunting me, it was systematically dismantling my grip on reality, proving its power was absolute and my perception was meaningless. For 2 days I was a ghost in my own home, moving through rooms with a hollow chest, my ears perpetually ringing with a silence that felt more threatening than any sound. I avoided my room until the last possible moment, sleeping fitfully on the couch downstairs, only to be woken each night not by a sound, but by the pervasive, icy cold that seeped through the house, finding me no matter where I hid. The isolation was complete. I was a prisoner, sentenced to terror, and my jailer was a memory that had physically followed me home. The idea of an offering did not come from a place of strength, but from utter desperation, a pathetic attempt at appeasement born from the superstitious part of the brain that believes all things, even nightmares, operate on a system of transaction. If this was a child from 1912, perhaps it was lonely. Perhaps it was angry at being forgotten. The logic was flimsy, childish, but it was the only action I could conceive that didn't involve surrendering completely to the madness. I drove to a dusty antique mall on the outskirts of town, a place that itself felt trapped in time. I wandered aisles crammed with the detritus of past lives until I found it. A small, hand-whittled wooden soldier, its paint faded, one arm slightly chipped. It was simple, old, and held a tangible loneliness that resonated with my own. It felt tragically appropriate. The walk back to my room that evening felt like a march to the gallows. In my hand, I clutched the small soldier and a little woven basket I'd taken from the kitchen. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and absurd, desperate hope. This was either the most foolish thing I had ever done, or my only chance at a fragile peace. With a reverence that felt both sacred and utterly insane, I approached the dark corner. I placed the basket on the floor, its homely presence a stark contrast to the supernatural dread that emanated from the space. Then, gently, I placed the wooden soldier inside it. It was a silent plea, a peace offering, a message sent blindly into the void. I see you. I acknowledge you. Please, just leave me alone. That night, the anticipation was a new form of torture. I lay rigid in bed, every sense screaming, waiting for the ritual to begin. The cold arrived first, a familiar wave of frigid air that washed over me and poured in from the corner. Then came the smell of loam and decay thick enough to taste. Finally, the breathing started. That slow, rhythmic, slumberous sound that had become the horrifying soundtrack of my life. But tonight something changed. The breathing paused. There was a moment of perfect, unnerving silence. Then a sound. A faint, delicate clack of wood against wood. It was the sound of the small soldier being moved, picked up, and examined within the basket. It was unmistakable, physical and real. It was not a trick of the mind, it was an interaction. A violent tremor racked my body, a convulsion of pure, unadulterated terror mixed with a grotesque sense of triumph. My experiment had worked. I had received a response. But the result was more horrifying than any silence could ever be. I had not quelled a spirit. I had fed a presence. I had confirmed a line of communication, and in doing so, I had invited a deeper, more tangible level of engagement. The breathing resumed, but its quality had shifted. It was no longer the sound of something asleep. It was the sound of something that was now awake, aware, and palpably pleased. The cold seemed to sharpen, focusing on me with a new predatory interest. I had not made peace. I had just taught it could ask for more. And I lay there frozen, knowing I would have to give it whatever it wanted. The entity's contentment was a palpable, chilling force in the room. For 3 nights after the offering, the haunting had subtly shifted. The oppressive dread remained, a constant cold weight in the air, but the sharp edges of terror had been sanded down. The breathing was still there, a constant reminder of its presence, but it had lost its predatory edge, settling into a sound that was almost placid. The smell of soil was less aggressive, more a background note than an assault. This semblance of peace was the most dangerous development yet. It made me drop my guard. It made me, in a moment of catastrophic weakness, believe that a truce might be possible. This fragile, horrifying calm was the bait in a trap I didn't see coming. The new request did not arrive with a bang, but with a quiet, insidious pull on my subconscious. It started as a simple, nagging thought while I was browsing online. A sudden, inexplicable urge to look at music boxes. Not modern ones, but antique ones, the kind with ceramic dolls and hand-cranked mechanisms. The thought felt like my own, but it had an alien weight to it, a compulsion that was difficult to ignore. The next day, the pull grew stronger. I found myself driving to the same antique mall, my body moving almost on autopilot. I told myself I was just browsing, just getting out of the house,
but a cold knot in my stomach knew the truth. I was being summoned. I was on an errand. I walked through the crowded aisles, a sense of surreal detachment fogging my mind. Then I saw it. Sitting on a high shelf, tucked between a tarnished silver tea set and a stack of old Life magazines, was a small porcelain music box. It was in the shape of a little girl in a faded blue dress, her painted smile slightly cracked, her eyes a vacant blue. She held a tiny basket of flowers. The compulsion in my mind sharpened into a single clear point. This one. A chill that had nothing to do with the mall's air conditioning crawled down my spine. This was not a random urge. This was an order. With trembling hands, I took it down. The porcelain was cold against my skin. I turned the key on its underside. It emitted a thin, tinny, and terribly off-key rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The melody warped and sad, like a memory from a forgotten childhood. That evening, the walk to my room felt like I was carrying a coffin. The music box weighed nothing in my hands, yet it felt heavier than any object I had ever held. I stood before the basket in the corner. The wooden soldier was still there, but it was no longer lying on its side. It was standing upright, positioned precisely in the center of the basket, as if placed there by careful, invisible hands. The sight stole the breath from my lungs. This was confirmation. This was a response. This was a demand for more. With a heart pounding so hard I felt lightheaded, I bent down and placed the music box gently next to the soldier. The little porcelain girl's vacant eyes seemed to stare directly into my soul. I retreated to my bed, a prisoner awaiting a verdict from a merciless warden. The change was immediate and violent. The room's temperature plummeted so rapidly I could see my breath mist in the air. The smell of wet earth returned with a vengeance, so thick and cloying it felt like I was breathing mud. And then the music started. The key on the music box began to turn, slowly, methodically, though no visible hand touched it. The warped, off-key melody of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star began to play. Each note, a jagged shard of glass, dragged across my nerves. It played with a slow, deliberate rhythm, over and over and over, a lullaby from a nightmare. And beneath the grotesque melody, the breathing continued, but it had changed. It was no longer calm. It was a rhythm of ravenous, greedy satisfaction. It wasn't just pleased with the gift, it was thrilled by my obedience. It had asked, and I had provided. I had become its servant, and the music box was the proof, playing its twisted song on an endless, horrifying loop throughout the long, sleepless night. The truce was over. I was now an active participant in my own haunting.
The music box played its warped, tinny lullaby for what felt like an eternity, a sound that drilled into my skull and coiled around my thoughts until I could think of nothing else. Its mechanism never wound down. It played through the night with a supernatural endurance, a constant, maddening reminder of the deal I had unknowingly struck. The entity's presence swelled with the music, the cold intensifying, the smell of soil becoming so thick it left a gritty taste on my tongue. Its satisfaction was a tangible force, a smug, icy aura that filled the room. It was no longer a passive observer. It was a curator, and I was its supplier, tasked with furnishing its lonely corner with trinkets from a dead era. The weight of this role was a new kind of prison. The compulsion for the next item did not arrive as a vague urge. It came as a command, sharp and clear and terrifyingly specific, whispered not into my ear, but directly into the core of my consciousness during a moment of fitful sleep. A name. Find the name.
The thought jerked me awake, my heart hammering. It wasn't asking for another object. It was asking for an identity. It wanted me to solve the mystery it represented. The horror of this new task was paralyzing. The library had yielded nothing. The historical records were a blank. How was I supposed to find a name for a soul erased from history, a task that had already defeated me? The pressure was immense, a psychic weight bearing down on me, and the off-key melody from the corners seemed to mock my desperation. Driven by this new, direct imperative, I returned to the woods. The hike felt like a walk to my own execution. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded like a warning. The sunny day did nothing to dispel the deep-seated dread that had taken root in my soul. I used the blurry photo on my phone, the one where the stone was now absent, to triangulate the general area of my fall. Pushing through the same brittle undergrowth, my body trembling with a mixture of fear and revulsion, I found the spot. The clearing was exactly as I remembered. Silent, oppressively still, and cold despite the sun overhead. And there it was, the stone. It was real. It had not vanished from the physical world, only from my digital record. It was still half buried, dark and ominous. I fell to my knees before it, not in reverence, but in exhausted despair. I scraped away the fresh layer of damp leaves and dirt, my fingers numb with cold and fear. The crude numbers 1898 to 1912 were still there, a stark testament to a short, forgotten life. But as I cleared more debris from the base of the stone, my fingers brushed against something else, something that hadn't been there before. Part of the stone, perhaps buried deeper or simply unseen in my initial panic, was revealed. Faint, worn almost smooth by a century of weather, were carved letters. My breath hitched. I scraped frantically, tearing a nail, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Slowly, painstakingly, a name emerged from the stone and the dirt. It wasn't a full name. It was a first name, a child's name. Alice. That was all. Just Alice. No last name, no epitaph. Just a single, lonely name for a life that lasted 14 years. The wind, which had been still moments before, picked up with a sudden, mournful sigh through the pine trees. It sounded like a whisper. It sounded like a sob. And in that moment, I felt a shift in the atmosphere around me, a profound and terrible release of sorrow that had been pent up for a century. The entity had a name. It was Alice. I had given her the first thing she had asked for that truly mattered. I didn't feel accomplishment. I felt a deep, devastating wave of pity and terror. I had not just found a name, I had confirmed a tragedy. I had given the presence in my room an identity, and in doing so, I had forged a connection that was infinitely more powerful and intimate than any offering of toys could ever be. The haunting was no longer about a forgotten grave. It was about Alice. And she was now more real and more powerful than ever before. I ran from that clearing, the name echoing in my mind, knowing I was no longer just a servant. I was becoming a friend to the thing in the corner. Armed with the name Alice, my desperation curdled into a frantic scholarly obsession. The entity was no longer an it. She was Alice. A girl who lived and died, and this fragment of her identity became my sole focus. The public library had failed me, but there were other repositories of memory. I spent the next day in the town's Historical Society archives, a dusty, cramped room that smelled of aging paper and abandonment. I combed through brittle, handwritten ledgers of old town censuses, my heart leaping at every instance of the name Alice between 1900 and 1912. I found several, but they were all accounted for. They had married, moved away, lived long lives. None died at 14. None vanished. The frustration was a physical ache. I was searching for a ghost in official documents, and she was proving to be a master of hiding even in history. The failure in the archive sent me spiraling. I returned home as evening fell, the weight of my unsuccessful quest making my steps heavy. The silence in the house felt accusatory. As I passed the hall mirror, a movement in the reflective depths caught my eye, a shift in the shadows of my room behind me, visible through the open door. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Slowly, against every screaming instinct, I turned around. The hallway light cast a weak yellow rectangle into my dark bedroom, and in the far corner, where the basket of offerings sat, the shadows were wrong. They were too deep, too concentrated. They didn't behave like normal shadows. They coalesced, forming a shape that was roughly humanoid, a silhouette of a small, slender figure sitting hunched over, its head bowed. It was a stain on reality, a patch of absolute darkness that drank the light around it. My breath hitched. This was new. This was a visual manifestation. Alice was no longer just a sensation. She was taking a form. I did not scream. I did not run. A morbid, terrifying fascination rooted me to the spot. I stood in the doorway watching the shadowy form for what felt like an eternity. It didn't move, but its very presence was a violation of physics, a quiet declaration that the natural world no longer applied in this space. The cold radiating from the corner was intense, a deep winter chill that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The warped melody of the music box began to play, though no key turned, its notes seeming to emanate from the shadow itself. It was a horrifying scene, yet underpinning the terror was that same devastating pity. The form was small. It was the shape of a child, a lonely, forgotten child sitting in the dark. The monstrous and the tragic were intertwined, and I couldn't separate them. The next morning, emboldened by the visual confirmation and driven by a compulsive need to understand the tragedy I was now hosting, I tried a different tactic. I went to the oldest cemetery in town, a place whose earliest graves dated back to the 1700s. I walked row by row, my eyes scanning the weathered, tilting stones for any Alice who died in 1912. The sun was bright, the birds were singing, but a funereal dread clung to me. And then I found it. Not her grave, but a clue. A family plot for the name Hargrove. And on a large ornate family monument, listed among other descendants, was a small separate plaque in memory of our beloved daughter, Alice Hargrove, 1898 to 1912. My heart stopped. This was it. The official record. The family had money, enough for a plaque, but why was her body not here? Why was she in an unmarked grave in the woods? The mystery deepened, becoming more sinister. I rushed home, my mind racing with this new information. Alice Hargrove. She had a full name. She had a family. I burst into my room, eager to what? To tell her? To show her I was listening? The room was ice cold. The shadow in the corner was gone, returned to its invisible state, but on the floor, in the center of the room, lay the small wooden soldier from the offering basket. It had been moved. It was placed precisely on a floorboard, pointing directly at my desk. A message. A command. I walked to my desk, my hands trembling. Lying on my keyboard was a single, brown, withered oak leaf. It was dry and crisp, long dead. It hadn't been there when I left. It was a message from the woods. It was a message from Alice. She knew I was getting closer, and she was helping me. The collaboration was now explicit. The haunting had become a partnership, and the next step of the investigation was about to begin. The terror was now fused with a dreadful, compelling purpose.
The withered oak leaf on my keyboard was not a threat. It was a key, a directive. It pointed toward the past, toward paper and ink. The name Hargrove echoed in my mind, a beacon in the oppressive fog of the haunting. This time, I didn't go to the public archives. I went back to the Historical Society, but with a new, grim determination. I asked the elderly volunteer, Mrs. Gable, directly, my voice barely a whisper. I'm researching the Hargrove family, specifically around 1912. Are there any private ledgers, diaries, anything not in the public records? She peered at me over her spectacles, her eyes curious, and then she nodded slowly. The Hargroves were private, but we have some of old Mr. Hargrove's business and personal account ledgers in the back. They were donated years ago. No one ever asks for those. She led me to a dusty, acid-free box. My hands shook as I opened it. The ledger for 1912 was bound in cracked leather, its pages brittle and yellowed. The handwriting was a tight, precise script detailing household expenses, business dealings, and social notations. I turned the pages with the utmost care, my heart thudding against my ribs. And then I found it. An entry dated October 17th, 1912. The script was still precise, but the ink was blotched in places as if written under great duress. It did not mention Alice by name. It read, "The affliction has taken its final toll. The doctor confirms it. To protect the family name and the others, she cannot rest in consecrated ground. The men will see to it tonight in the old grove. God forgive us. A necessary sorrow. $20 for their discretion." The words swam before my eyes. The affliction. In 1912, it could have been anything. Tuberculosis, scarlet fever, a mental illness deemed a shameful blight on a wealthy family's reputation. She was hidden away, her death unmarked, her burial a secret transaction, her memory erased to protect a name. She wasn't just forgotten, she was willingly abandoned. A profound, silent sob racked my body. The horror of her story was now complete, and it was more devastating than any supernatural terror. Alice had not simply died, she had been made to disappear by her own family. Her grave was not a tragedy of poverty, it was a cold, calculated act of shame. I closed the ledger, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. I had her story. I knew her name and the cruel injustice of her end. I drove home in a trance, the world outside the car window seeming gray and insignificant compared to the century-old tragedy I now carried. I entered my room. It was preternaturally still and cold, the air thick with expectation. The little porcelain music box began to play its warped lullaby, a haunting, melancholy tribute. I walked to the center of the room, directly facing the corner where the shadow had manifested. I didn't have a plan, I only had the truth. I spoke aloud, my voice cracking but clear in the frozen silence. "Alice Hargrove, I know your name. I know what they did to you. I am so sorry." The moment the words left my lips, the music box stopped mid-note. The cold intensified sharply, biting into my skin. The shadow in the corner surged forward, deepening, thickening, until it was no longer a silhouette, but a column of swirling absolute darkness. I could feel a potent mix of anguish, rage, and relief emanating from it, an emotional storm that sucked the air from the room. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ceased. The darkness in the corner collapsed in on itself, vanishing. The crushing cold lifted. The smell of fresh earth faded, replaced by the neutral, stale air of my room. The music box was silent. The wooden soldier lay still in its basket. The oppressive weight, the breathing, the watching presence, it was all gone. The room was just a room. A profound, echoing silence fell, so complete it was almost deafening. Alice was at peace. The truth had been her absolution. I stood alone in the sudden, ordinary quiet, surrounded by the relics of her short life, the weight of her story now mine to remember. The haunting was over. But as I looked at the small, offered toys, I knew I would never truly be free. I had not just survived a ghost story. I had become the keeper of a lost grave, and the memory of Alice Hargrove would linger in that quiet corner of my room long after the cold had faded.